I want to welcome everyone who's joining our fabulous panel today. As I noted at the start a little while ago, we're going to be talking in this panel about how state level policy actually impacts some of the challenges and opportunities that we're seeing and that we've learned more about during the course of the summit, how state level policy can impact district level decision-making and decision-making all the way down to the classroom level and teacher and student level. And with me, I've got three amazing panelists. And rather than introduce them, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. You've seen their bios on the summit information sheet. And I'm also going to ask them when they introduce themselves to follow me in just giving a little bit about their background and why the issue of reading and reading instruction became so important to them. So again, my name is Arun Ramanathan. I'm the CEO of Pivot Learning. Reading instruction, and you heard this a lot from the folks, particularly the superintendent of LA Unified. Reading instruction as an English learner was my path into reading the books that gave me a view of the world and also an opportunity to succeed in ways that helped and continue to help my family. I actually took that experience with reading into my work as a special education teacher and had the opportunity to see it transform the lives of my students. So it's wonderful to be leading a panel with three folks who've had similar history and experience. And I will actually ask them in alphabetical order to talk a little bit about who they are and what brought them to this work. So last name first, Kymyona, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm in Central Time, so I think it may still be morning in California. I'm Kymyona Burk, and I'm currently the Senior Policy Fellow for Early Literacy at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, known as ExcelinEd, and we're a policy advocacy organization focused on student-centered K-12 policies, and early literacy is my area. I have just the joy and pleasure to work on a national level with advancing early literacy policy across the country. I'm the former state literacy director for the Mississippi Department of Education, and I led the work and the implementation of our Literacy-Based Promotion Act, which is our Read by Three, our comprehensive Read by Three law from 2013 until 2019. And we were able to see some amazing gains during that time, especially for I'll just say briefly, I'm Senior Policy Fellow for Early Literacy for ExcelinEd, and we're a policy advocacy organization, and we work nationally on student-centered K-12 education policies. And former State Literacy Director for the Mississippi Department of Education. I led our initial implementation of our Literacy-Based Promotion Act from 2013 to 2019, and we were able to see some unprecedented growth or gains on NAEP, and that work is continuing here in Mississippi. The way that I was able to really get into this work is I'm an alternate route. I came through education through alternate route certification, and I've taught elementary, middle, and high school, but it was as I was teaching my high school students, I taught English. And I saw how many students were sitting in my classrooms who were struggling readers. And that did something to me internally about how they were able to get that far and not have their deficiencies addressed. And so I started this journey from there. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Okay. And again, I'm hoping that we don't get any more glitches. And for folks who just joined us, we're going through panelist introductions. They're going to tell us a little bit about their background. And then they're also going to tell us a little bit about what brought them to this work in the beginning. And Kymyona just finished up, and I'll shift over to Anji.
I feel like if I don't touch anything, I won't be flipped back around rooms. So hopefully everything will stay the same. You're doing wonderful, this group. So good afternoon. I'm Anji Gallanos, and I currently serve in the role for the Department of Education in Colorado as the Elementary Literacy and School Readiness Director. I have been in Colorado for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was the Language Arts Director for the Department of Education in Alaska, and have been in education for about probably 30 years. I think important context related to my path would be that I was an early grade teacher early on in my career without the tools that I needed to teach my students how to read. Reading always just seemed like this big thing that I wasn't really prepared to do. I was in special education and in kindergarten. And I remember being asked to transition into a reading interventionist role. And I didn't have really any background in that, and I wasn't really sure what to do, but somebody handed me a big bunch of materials and said, next year, you're going to be a reading interventionist. And in order to do this work, you'll need to go to the summer session in learning how to teach reading. And my entire summer was spent teaching reading, learning how to teach reading from a whole language approach. And then, so I learned through that, and then I went into the classroom in the fall and realized that I was completely ill-prepared to teach my students. And I had a whole bunch of curricular resources that were in conflict with each other. And it was one of the most confusing, one of the most devastating years that I think I ever had. And I understand what it is to be a teacher, not knowing where to go next, not knowing what your resources are. And I've carried that feeling of that year with me every year since then in the work that I do. I know when we know better, we can do better. And I'm so excited to lead the work. You're going to hear more about what Colorado does in a moment, but I think that we're doing amazing work in our state. And I'm so proud of the policymakers and the teams that are doing this, because I know that that means that if there are teachers out there that were like me in that year, that they're getting the help they need. So I believe, Alicia, you're next.
Thanks. So I'm Alicia Smith, and I'm joining from tiny Ontario, Canada, tiny like very small. I am the Executive Director of Dyslexia Canada, which is Canada's national dyslexia charity. We are working on advocacy nationally, and I'm also the president of the Ontario branch of the International Dyslexia Association in a volunteer capacity. And both IDA Ontario and Dyslexia Canada have been working to raise the issue of reading as a human rights issue across Canada. And in Ontario, I think specifically, I'm going to be speaking about what we've done there. We brought that issue forward and I guess I'll speak a bit more about that later, but to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and have recently made some major changes in what's happening in Ontario by framing the issue of reading instruction in that light as an issue of human rights. And where I come to this area of passion is through an intergenerational lens. So I was identified as dyslexic myself when I was in high school. And though my father was never identified as dyslexic, I know he absolutely was. And he was also raised in poverty. But having access to effective reading instruction, even back in the 1950s, he received intervention in school starting when he was in grade 1. He was able to learn to read and go to university and raise his family. And so when my own son started to have similar struggles with reading that I had when I was a child, and I'm sure my father had, and then realizing that those supports were no longer in place or available within the public education system in Ontario, and that to get the support that my son would need required a huge amount of financial input that we were able to bring to him. So my son did become successful. But always I was thinking about those systemic issues of the intersectionality between learning difficulties, socioeconomic status, and all of those other factors that really is the big why of why we're doing this, so that every child can get off to a good start with reading, with school, and with life.
And appreciate hearing a little bit about each of your backgrounds and what brought you to this work. As each of you have approached the work, you've taken different paths, and I think that's what's fascinating about it. Anji, Kymyona, you've taken a legislative path and a state policy path. And Alicia, you took a legal and a human rights path. California, to date, has not had a statewide approach, either one that has been taken from a human rights perspective or one from a legislative perspective. And what I'm wondering is, as you approached the work and as you started the work, how did you think about shifting the mindsets of policymakers who often have many, many things on their minds other than reading, to starting to think about reading? And Alicia, maybe I'll actually start with you, and you know, that human rights perspective is a different approach than what's traditionally been taken.
Thanks. So I'll say that we found it very, very difficult to get reading on the radar of our elected politicians. We also found it very, very difficult to raise it through the traditional channels of education in Ontario, going through the Ministry of Education, trying to address it at the faculties of education. We really weren't getting very far. So that's why this decision to try to take it through the legal route as a human rights complaint was what was attempted. And I should say there were many people that were working on this long before I came to it. So I don't want to make it sound like I was the one who, you know, single-handedly put this together, because that's not at all what happened. But IDA Ontario worked collaboratively with Dyslexia Canada and with our Decoding Dyslexia chapter in Ontario to bring together a whole host of parents from right across the province who had similar experiences of kids going into that balanced literacy classroom, because that's very much what we had across Ontario. We did not have screening happening, so it was very much the wait to fail model. The kids getting to grade 3, grade 4, that being the first time that they were really getting an assessment, and then everyone sort of realizing that the amount of intervention that you need when a child is that old was simply not available within the system. So we packaged that up as a systemic issue, so that it was no longer just a one-off issue, because that's kind of the way it was being approached previously. And we brought it forward as an issue of systemic discrimination, is the way that we framed it. And in Canada, we had a legal precedent through the Supreme Court of Canada in 2012 that tied the right to effective reading instruction to the right to education. So it confirmed that you are not realizing your right to education if you haven't also been provided with effective reading instruction. So we argued that the system that we had in place in Ontario, that balanced literacy with the wait to fail sort of model, was a systemic violation of the human rights of these kids. And that was, we were able to get it through the Human Rights Commission. And then they launched a full public inquiry, which lasted 2.5 years. It was a very in-depth inquiry that was done with a full audit of a representative sample of school boards. They audited all of the faculties of education to see how teachers were being trained and what they were learning in pre-service as well as continuing professional development. And that was unprecedented in Canadian history. There's never been a public inquiry looking into a specific teaching practice or how things are done. So that was really what allowed us to gain the attention of the policymakers, and also to gain the attention of district administrators, because knowing that this thing was looming over their heads was our in, really, for getting in there to talk to them. But then pushing them forward was a whole different story. But that was what we did to get their attention, is what I'd say.
And Kymyona, you actually took this at a policy level, right? And started in Mississippi. And since then, the work in Mississippi has translated to many other states. How did you begin? How did you get the attention of policymakers to this issue?
Well, our story actually began is very unique. But since then, we've had a lot of, as you stated, states that have follow this path, but our initial entry into adopting a law around the science of reading was spearheaded by our former governor. Our governor and our legislature, specifically our Senate Ed chair at the time, former Senator Gray Tollison, and our former governor reached out to ExcelinEd, and our chairman of the board is former Governor Jeb Bush. And as you know, Florida had passed a similar law in 2002, and they had begun seeing success, especially with their subgroups and their overall population. And our state decided to go forth with this law. And I think the buy-in for us was really around those who would be impacted the most. You know, we had to get buy-in from parents. We had to get buy-in from our educators, our teachers and administrators who were on the ground in those classrooms. And we had to really convince them that this type of law, a read by 3 law, and really saying that we have to make sure that students are reading by the end of 3rd grade so that they can read to learn as they move forward, was something that there were questions around, are we ready? You know, have we done what we needed to do? Mississippi had always been on the bottom of all the lists as it relates to education and being ranked. But one thing that we had to do was to not only say that we need children to read by the end of 3rd grade, but to also say that we're going to help you get there. And that's what helped us with buy-in. And I know Superintendent Thurman talked earlier about putting literacy coaches in schools. And we all know that that's just one component of what we need as far as a comprehensive approach is concerned. But for us, it was giving our teachers the professional development that they need, empowering them with the knowledge, putting the coaches in there to support them with transferring theory to practice. Then also, again, making sure that we are talking to parents, making parents aware very early and often how their children are doing, how their children are doing, and just opening up that partnership with parents, and then of course, in families. And of course, making sure that our students were receiving the interventions that they needed. And a lot of this had to do with guidance from our state agency, and it changed the perception of our state agency. We had not normally been viewed as this type of agency that would go out and help and provide boots on the ground. It was really an auditing agency, right? We wanted to make sure you were doing what you were supposed to be doing, but really not providing the support to get you there. So all of that changed when we passed our law, and the buy-in was the most important part, again, with those stakeholders who were on the ground.
Well, both of you have noted the importance of buy-in from a broader set of folks than just policymakers. But Anji, you've been in and wondering about that issue too, in 2 what folks would call different states, red Alaska and purple Colorado. Was it a similar process there in terms of getting folks' attention?
You know, I think a little bit of what Kymyona spoke to, and also Alicia, is the absolute dedication by legislative advocates within the legislature that are steadfast in the belief of what they're doing, and the power of understanding what science of reading and the reading, what we can do for students. I think that's been clear. I've watched as Friends in Alaska just passed the Alaska Reads Act, and then also working with the Colorado Read Act. It has really been accumulation of many dedicated folks. But without that legislative mandate and without a hard, solid policy, I'm not sure that all initiatives can really succeed to the extent that Mississippi has, or that other states that have K-3 reading initiatives. It really does take strong, solid policy and policy leaders that have an absolute understanding and belief in what they're doing.
So when you talk about policy, and that actually leads us to our next question, again, you heard the superintendent. We're going to have a literacy director. California has not had a comprehensive literacy policy. What are the elements of the policies that your states passed, and what should California learn from what you've been doing now for many, many years? Any of you all can chime in.
I'll start. Yeah, I'll start if that's okay. I think that it's extremely important, and I did see, I've seen the announcement, coming around in emails about the state literacy director position. And I'll say this to that. Infrastructure in the California Department of Education is going to be extremely important. One thing that I've really had conversations with policymakers about recently is that, yes, it's great, as Angie said, we have to have these champions. We have to have those policymakers who are bold and who say, you know what, now is the time, and we want to make sure that this is a requirement everywhere. There also has to be a conversation with the Department of Ed to let them know what's coming, right? Or to even ensure that they have the capacity to implement all of these things, all of these different components. I know that we've been just kind of talking about that are in the law. We didn't have a literacy department at the MDE, but when the law passed, they created my division. And I was able to I started out with 23 staff, including an assistant director. And by the time I left, I had 80 coaches and coordinators who were in schools. So it was, in addition to my office, our state chief also stood up an Office of Intervention Services that could answer questions about dyslexia, an English learner specialist. So there are things that are going to be in the law that if we're not looking at supporting implementation of it, the progress will be stalled. So hiring a state literacy director is going to be a great first step, but this person is going to have staff, right? And other offices that are aware of the work and can support the work. It's going to be extremely important for Office of Special Education to be involved in the conversations around addressing the needs of students. So I think that with all of what's happening and all that's going to be required of supporting teachers, administrators, students, and parents and families, that we have to make sure that we're taking a look at what the requirements of the law are going to be on the one hand, the policy piece, then also the implementation to practice piece, and how we can make sure that we are providing this support for the doers of the work.
I can jump in next, Arun, if that's okay. I don't want to bump into Alicia either. The Colorado READ Act is multifaceted and has many components, and the work from the State Department of Education and down to the school and district level can be overwhelming without the staff that we have. And I just want to give a shout out to my Department of Education folks that are in this room, because we don't walk alone. We are a large group who have many policy pieces that we're tasked with implementing. And we have partners across the state and districts that are also champions for this work. So ensuring that there are opportunities for California to really support this legislation or support the work across the state is going to be important. Colorado's approached this in a way where the Colorado READ Act was implemented in 2012, but it's gone through many amendments. And the most recent amendment in 2019 called for Colorado to require that any district that is receiving READ Act dollars, and I can talk about that as well, requires every single teacher in kindergarten through third grade to be trained in the science of reading. We offer a free science of reading course. It's 45 hours to every K-3 teacher. There are other pathways to do this. But in order for us to turn around and require that every K-3 teacher in the state not only takes the training, but demonstrates that they passed an end of course assessment, and that we record and document every single teacher in the state, could not be done without the many hands that are making light work of this, so to speak. That's been foundational. We're about ready to launch into a principal training as well, where we would be requiring every principal in the state of Colorado to take training in the science of reading. Additionally, our team also supports the review of instructional programs. We do a very thorough review of curriculum in Colorado. That takes not just our team at the Colorado Department of Education, but 10, 20 to 30 to 40, even 50 district team members and experts in the field to really help us review curricula and assessments, which we are also doing. So all of that to say that policy is critical. Legislative leaders who support policy and understand it, school boards of education, state boards of education, but without the support that is needed to actually get laws implemented, both at the district and the state level, it could be very difficult. I can't imagine doing the work that we do without the great team we have. We have a staff of about 15 to 20, and that's just in our elementary literacy team. We also have folks that really support this work across the Department of Education. So I echo what Kymyona is saying, in that I hope California really sees how important it is going to be to stand up solid teams and solid stakeholders across the state to really get this implemented.
Well, I'll just jump in there and say I want to move to Colorado. That sounds amazing. So we, our initiative, the Right to Read report and recommendations came out in February. So we are still very much in the process of working through those legislative and policy pieces. But we did have an immediate commitment on the part of the government to change the curriculum, which we use the term curriculum in Canada a little bit differently than it's used in the States, and that we're not talking about, it's more the standards, the reading standards is what I'm talking about. And our provincial reading standards previously actually had 3Qing written right into them. And because of that, all of the resource materials that were used in all of the school boards were entirely designed around 3Qing and like LLI benchmark assessments and all of those things. So at least getting that policy piece has helped us to start those conversations in the school districts. And those resources are starting to get removed and they are starting to replace them. They also put out a new policy guide that spelled out all of the components of structured literacy. So that was good. But again, we don't have the same level of infrastructure that you have in place in Mississippi or California, or sorry, in Colorado yet to support that. And one of the parallels, I think, between Ontario and California is that we do have a very high degree of local control. So the standards have always been written here to be very intentionally vague, right? Like our spelling standard for grade 1 is children will be able to spell some words. Grade 2 is children will be able to spell many words. Like that's it, right? So with that level of vagueness, it is very difficult. But we are certainly looking at, I should say we're pushing ahead with trying to ask for those same sorts of things. So I was literally in a meeting today where I was bringing up what they're doing in Colorado as an example of here's what we should be looking at doing in Ontario. But the progress that we have been able to make, I would say, has been primarily teacher driven. That's kind of the success that we're having, is getting that grassroots movement with teachers. But we really do need to have the same sorts of teams that you're discussing. That's the ultimate solution, and we really need to get those things in place here.
And actually that leads into my next and final question, and then I'll open it up after that for questions from folks, which is, how do you, I mean, you've talked about the trainings, talked about staffing up at the department. The legal push, I think, is a really interesting one, and the defining reading as a human right. But with that issue of local control, how do you actually change practices? And there are many districts that I've worked with, or that we work with in states that have these laws where the practices don't seem to be changing that quickly. So I'll turn it back to you all and ask, what are the levers beyond the training?
I can jump in if that's okay. It's really important to understand that in Colorado, the initiative, some of the components of the initiative are written in statute, meaning that there is no area for noncompliance. In statute, it's written that every district and every school will provide an evidence-based curricula for their students at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So that's in statute. It's also in statute that every child receives screening, universal screening for significant reading deficiencies. So that's in statute, and that is a non-negotiable. The other initiatives are tied to funding. In Colorado, each student who's identified with a significant reading deficiency based on universal screening is tied to dollars. So in Colorado, that means that if you're a large school district and you have, X amount of students, you get X amount of dollars per student that are identified. The district can then use for approved intervention, approved programming. So the desire to continue to receive those dollars for students has propelled districts into really making choices that are aligned to providing high quality intervention services for students. Not all districts choose to take those dollars, and they still are required to screen all students. They're still required to provide an evidence-based curricula. They're still required to name their curricula they're using in their district. So in Colorado, there's a little bit of a combination between statute and money that I think provides support to really ensure that policy can be implemented.
And I want to just take that a step further with the statute. And, I always say that a literacy law to me is an equity law, that it begins the process of requiring that all of these things that we're talking about, evidence-based best practices, adopting the right curricula, adopting the right screeners, those types of assessments. That's a great first step. One thing that we found, because I believe all states have their MTSS or their RTI model that requires students to be screened, especially if they're going to go through the process of, tier 2, tier 3 interventions and those things. But we had that in statute before we passed our Literacy-Based Promotion Act. But we also included the universal screening 3 times per year there. And we had people saying, oh my gosh, we have to screen students 3 times per year. And I was like, well, it's been in statute for a long time. So I think that with this type of law, with having a staff, with having an office, a director, a lead, that stakeholder awareness begins this process of accountability, right? So we passed the law, we have it in statute. Now, how are we going to hold people accountable for actually doing these things that are required? Literacy coaches were great for us. They were on the ground, especially in our lowest performing schools. But then I know someone put into the chat about school boards. Extremely important. We also have local control here in Mississippi. But again, there are things that are in statute that are non-negotiable. But we have to educate those who are responsible for carrying these things out. One of the first things we did was in Mississippi, we had our school boards, our state school boards conference. We talked about our Literacy-Based Promotion Act, the roles and responsibilities of the state ed agency, the school district, the schools, the parents and families. So we have to make sure that stakeholders are aware. And specifically with our parents and families, do they know that there should be a screening report coming home, that indicates if their child has a reading deficiency, and it also indicates what the school should be doing about it? How can we make so many people aware of what these requirements are that it leaves no room for error as it relates to accountability? How can we monitor and make sure that these things are happening? And I think that's going to be the biggest piece between putting it in statute, implementation, but how are we making sure? And there are several states that have reporting as well. And I know Colorado, the rankings are amazing. Just championed a curriculum transparency law where school districts must place on their district website the curricula that they're using. So will that even make sense to someone who doesn't know that the curriculum doesn't need to include 3Qing? So that's the other part of Colorado's work, is making sure that all the stakeholders understand if it's 3Qing, if it's guessing, if it's using visual cues, it's bad. If it's phonics and language comprehension and oral language and those opportunities, then it's good. So it's about the stakeholder awareness and also the accountability for making sure that these things are getting done. And you just have so many people in your business, right? that's when you're saying, okay, I remember, I know someone at this school, their parent received a screener report. Where's mine? Right. So accountability is going to be key too.
Yeah,
So,
I would love to. Oh, sorry. Did you want to just move on to questions?
No. I was going to say, which ones are do you want all of those things? What else would you like to see in Ontario?
Yeah, all of those things. But I was just going to follow on and say that stakeholder awareness piece is really, really important. And we found that, we had been trying to bring these issues forward to the Ministry of Education, to school districts. And, you bring up terms like, are you using evidence-based practices? And they really think that they are. So the way that the Human Rights Commission went about it was they put together a set of benchmarks, and they said, here are the things that you need to be doing to make sure that you're honoring every student's right to read. And that is, you need to be using evidence-based tier 1 classroom instruction. You need to be screening all of the kids. You need to be providing an evidence-based intervention at all of those tiers. And like Kymyona said, like we had multi-tiered written into our special education policies. And so people thought they were doing that, but really in reality, they weren't. So when the initial investigation happened, the Human Rights Commission sent out a big, long, and they have the power to compel information here too, to the district leaders. They sent out this big, what are you doing questionnaire. And they all initially answered very confidently, oh, yes, we are using evidence-based practices. We have, the Fontes and Pinnell classroom reading system, and it's fantastic. So it was very much that piece of making them aware of what the practices actually are. And that's really the work that we've been doing. The ongoing work is in terms of working with teachers. And we have now developed a really large grassroots network of teachers who are really excited to learn about this. And they're sort of spreading the information amongst themselves like wildfire. It's been great. And then also educating parents. So after those recommendations came out of the Human Rights Commission, we repackaged them into a simple little letter that parents can bring to school to say, hey, can you tell me what are you doing for classroom instruction? Are you doing screening? What are these things? So just making sure everybody has that information. And that's really what's putting the pressure on the higher up levels to really look at those policies and hopefully put in place the actual resources and the people that need to be there to make it a systemic change.
And Alicia, you said you were in the town of Tiny, but Ontario is a very large state, right, with 15 million people. And Kymyona and Anji, you've worked in big state. You work in big states. California is a very big state. What is, from your perspective, how can stakeholder engagement help in the state push policy?
Go ahead, Kymyona.
Well, I'll just speak briefly. I know someone put into the chat something about regional, approaching it in that way. And we do have regional education and service agencies here. We do not have teachers unions, so that's something that we can talk about as we're getting through with questions. But we do have regional service education agencies, and we have been 6 of them, and we've been able to push out information through those regions. And again, it's going to be about just making sure that you are educating those who are delivering this message, and that there is a consistent message. I'm a fan of guidance documents. I am a huge fan of guidance documents and FAQs, so that when there are questions that stakeholders are not getting different answers. We have a lot of grassroots groups here in Mississippi. One of the first issues was, how is this going to impact Black kids? We have a retention component in our law, right? Are all the Black kids going to fail? And so we have to make sure that we are focusing on the message, a clear, consistent message, and that empowering teachers, again, those who are standing in front of kids every day, is one of the most powerful things that we can do for equity for our students. Go ahead, Anji.
I'm reflecting on the chat about how we included state teacher unions or powerful voices. And I think as educators, and I'm just going to go back to what was said this morning, when we know better, we do better. And I think that when you appeal to those that really do want to see kids succeed, and you share with them what research-based reading means. What does it mean to actually provide those supports? You're speaking to teachers at heart. You're speaking to people that really do want to have the best interest of children in their minds. I believe that. But I also think that they also are going off of how they taught and how they were taught in their own systems. And so I think really educating and providing support and understanding of what does it mean to really align your teaching practices to the science that is out there is first and foremost. And then I would say second, it's been my experience that the more that we listen and we hear what the barriers to policy implementation are, that we have a better opportunity to really understand what the voices are saying. I wrote this in the chat, but Colorado just trained 21,000 K through 3 teachers in the state during the pandemic. 21,000 teachers took a 45-hour asynchronous training on the science of reading during the pandemic. We thought that that would be an impossible task. But shout out to those that really were eager to elevate their practices and change and make changes that were really going to be relevant for them. So I do think that coming in and really helping understand what it is that you're doing and why we would need to be changing these practices in the first place is part of the first step of really engaging your stakeholders and listen.
There's a question, and I think you all have answered it to some extent already, around professional development, stakeholders and unions, but the one on actual teacher education and the universities. I don't know if we have enough time. 4 minutes may not be enough, but any points you wanted to make around that and how that intersects with policy?
I can jump in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead, Alicia.
Oh, I was just going to jump in around how that intersects with policy in Ontario is that there's a huge interconnectedness between the University of Toronto's Faculty of Education, which is basically right next door to our Ministry of Education. So that has been really problematic because there are some very, Frank Smith actually taught there at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Education, one of the fathers of the whole language. He's loved, still loved. And so that has been a real challenge, is what I'd say, is trying to get this through the faculties of education. And we actually had several of the faculties of education, or I shouldn't say the faculties of education, but prominent professors within the faculties of education come out after the human rights report was released and try very hard in the popular media to discredit the report and claim that, actually there's evidence on both sides, your science and my science and that sort of thing. So we haven't seen a lot of movement yet. There's a little bit of movement from a few of the smaller universities, but what we really do need is a strong partnership to develop there. I don't know if the other speakers have had more luck. I hope you have. And maybe we can learn from how you did that.
I'll just say briefly, states like Tennessee and North Carolina, they have included higher ed in their read by 3 policies. Higher ed, I talked about this a little bit last night, must begin to see themselves in K-12 outcomes. What they teach our candidates directly impacts how well our candidates are prepared when they become teachers on their first day in the classroom. So even in statute, guidance around coursework, that they should include 5 components of reading, assessments, assessing for dyslexia, characteristics, those types of things. So there are states that have included higher ed in the discussion in a way that it is required. The one thing that we are missing is ensuring that faculty themselves, as you mentioned, have the knowledge to teach their pre-service teachers about the science of reading. So that's another challenge that we're facing, getting faculty to go back and go through this 45 hours of training or to ensure that they have the knowledge to support their pre-service candidates.
Really briefly, I'll say that in Colorado, as part of our educator talent unit, Colorado is tasked with providing a review of university programs, their ed prep programs, and part of that is a responsibility for my team to go in just to review how those universities are teaching reading. That hasn't always been an easy task. There's been a lot of switching and a lot of hard conversations that have happened with some of the prominent educator prep universities here in Colorado. But again, I just go back to that steadfast, focused line of policymakers and leaders in our department that have said this is important. And I'm beginning to see universities really think about how they can change their courses and change their programs.
All right. Well, we've hit the 11:50 point. I know there's a question about private schools. Angie, you shot a note back around that, but we'll follow up on anything in the chat that hasn't been answered in the panel. I want to thank our three amazing panelists, and great appreciation to them and extraordinarily hopeful news about their work and the long-term impact of the work. One last piece of advice for California, any of you, before we sign off?
Make sure that state literacy director, whoever that is, has the support and allow this person to lead and also adopt a statute, adopt legislation.
Stay the course, stay focused. This is important work. It's going to be a long road. There are going to be a lot of folks that will push back, but stick with it. This isn't just a pendulum swing. This is a focused effort. It needs a lot of people involved in it.
And I would just say, don't take no for an answer. Reading is a human right.
On that note, I think we've hit the break time. So thank you all. Thank you to our panelists, and see you soon.